On the evening of January 13, 2012, a brief news report appeared on the news. A cruise ship had run aground off the coast of Italy. It sounded like a minor incident. A ship had run aground. Well, sometimes they'd refloat it, evacuate the passengers, and life would go on. But when the first photos emerged the next morning, the world saw something entirely different. A gigantic, snow-white cruise ship lay on its side off the shore of a tiny Italian island, like an overturned toy in a giant's bathtub. The decks, which only yesterday had been aglow with lights and filled with music, were now awash. Lifeboats hung over the side at impossible angles. This was more than just an accident. It was a catastrophe that forever changed the cruise industry and became the most notorious shipwreck since the Titanic. This is the story of the Costa Concordia, the story of how human vanity, negligence, and a series of incredible mistakes led to the deaths of 32 people and the destruction of a ship worth more than $500 million. Costa Cruises, or simply Costa, is one of the oldest cruise lines in Europe. Founded in the mid-19th century as an Italian cargo shipping company, it gradually grew into one of the largest cruise ship operators in the Mediterranean. In 2000, the company was acquired by Carnival, the world's largest cruise conglomerate, owning dozens of brands and hundreds of ships. Under Carnival's wing, Costa began ordering new, increasingly larger ships. In 2004, Costa Concordia, the first ship of an entirely new class, was ordered. The vessel was built at the Fincantieri shipyard in Italy and entered service on June 30, 2006. The construction cost was $570 million. At the time of her launch, Concordia was the largest ship in Costa's history. She was 290 meters long and 35.5 meters wide. 13 passenger decks rose above the water. A top speed of 23 knots was possible. This was the flagship of the fleet, and the company ensured that the ship was the best it had to offer. The ship boasted 5 restaurants and 13 bars. A massive 2-story spa occupied an entire deck. 4 swimming pools, including a central one with an outdoor movie screen and a family pool with a winding water slide, provided entertainment for passengers of all ages. The ship's main atrium soared 10 decks high, creating a dizzying sense of space and luxury. With 1,502 passenger cabins and 601 crew cabins, the ship could carry a maximum of 4,890 people per voyage. Concordia embodied everything the modern cruise industry had achieved: a glittering, floating city, carrying thousands across the azure waters of the Mediterranean in absolute comfort and safety. Or so it seemed. From its commissioning in 2006, the ship was commanded by Francesco Schettino, an Italian captain who had worked for Costa since 2002. Concordia operated regular cruises throughout the Mediterranean, serving primarily the Italian market. Year after year, she carried hundreds of thousands of passengers without a single serious incident. This continued for nearly 6 years, until one January night changed the cruise industry forever. On January 11, 2012, the Costa Concordia departed from the port of Civitavecchia for its latest 7-day Mediterranean cruise. It was Friday the 13th. The ship's official route ran through the center of the strait between mainland Italy and Giglio Island, a small island in the Tyrrhenian Sea with a population of about 800. However, Captain Schettino decided to deviate from the approved route and take the ship much closer to the island. This maneuver is called a salute, when the ship passes close to the shore to greet people on land and allow passengers to admire the views. This tradition dates back to the days of sailing ships, when ships would salute coastal forts and settlements. In the modern cruise fleet, salutes were not uncommon. The Concordia itself performed similar maneuvers on numerous occasions, including near Giglio Island. Costa's former captain lived on Giglio, and fireworks in his honor became something of an unofficial tradition for the company's ships passing the island. But tradition is one thing, and safety is quite another. Guiding a 300-meter-long liner so close to a rocky shore in the dark, relying on visual navigation, is not tradition. It's a gamble. And that evening, everything went wrong. By nightfall, the Concordia was heading off course toward Giglio Island. The January night was moonless and dark. The island's lights flickered ahead on the starboard side. On the bridge, the officers of the watch steered the ship, while Captain Schettino dined in the restaurant among the passengers, enjoying wine and Italian cuisine as his ship headed toward the rocks. The officers had been ordered to maintain a distance of at least 450 meters from the shore, the distance determined to be safe. By 10:41 a.m., the Concordia was traveling at 15 knots and preparing to turn to pass the island. The captain returned to the bridge. He was not alone. A woman had come up with him. Later it would be revealed that she was his lover, whom he had invited on board. This fact would become one of the most scandalous details of the disaster, but the tragedy was only minutes away, and at that moment no one was thinking about such things. A fatal error occurred on the bridge. There was a misunderstanding between the captain and the helmsman regarding the proper course to turn. Due to the incorrect course parameters, the ship's turning radius was significantly wider than planned. This meant that the enormous 300-meter-long vessel passed 659 meters closer to shore than it should have. 659 meters. For a ship of that size, that's the difference between life and death. The captain immediately ordered the rudder to be adjusted 20 degrees to starboard, but it was too late. At 21:44, the Concordia's port side collided with underwater rocks. The impact was devastating. A granite rock ripped open the ship's steel hull like a can opener rips open a tin can. The hole stretched 60 meters, the length of half a football field. Several watertight compartments were punctured. Thousands of tons of seawater gushed inside the ship. Concordia instantly lost both main engines and the main power generators. The enormous liner, just racing through the night sea at 15 knots, suddenly froze in the darkness, helpless and immobilized. The loss of engines meant the ship could no longer maneuver. The loss of generators meant the lights went out, the elevators stopped, the public address system went silent. For a few long seconds, 4,229 people found themselves in pitch darkness, amidst the sea, on a sinking ship. Panic broke out in the main dining rooms, where hundreds of passengers were enjoying dinner. Tables shifted, dishes and glasses flew to the floor, and the lights flickered and went out. Seconds later, emergency generators kicked in, and the dim lighting returned. At 21:51, an announcement came over the ship's intercom, assuring passengers that the situation was under control and that technicians were working to fix the problem. They were told it was a routine technical glitch. This was a lie. At that very moment, the bridge received a report that 3 watertight compartments had been breached and that water had reached the main electrical panel. Captain Schettino relayed this information to the Costa Cruises Crisis Center. The situation was rapidly deteriorating. At 10:07 p.m., the port contacted Concordia, but the crew reported that the problem was merely a power outage and that everything was under control. Another lie. At that moment, the deputy chief engineer ascended to the bridge to personally report to the officers. The flooding had spread to compartments 4, 5, 6, and 7. The ship began to list as water filled the watertight compartments. Passengers, feeling the deck tilting, began to lower themselves down to the 4th deck, where the lifeboats were located. And all this time, neither the captain nor Costa Cruises contacted the rescue services or the Coast Guard. Captain Schettino made a decision that likely saved hundreds of lives. He allowed the ship to drift toward shallow water, hoping that, in the worst-case scenario, it would settle on the seabed near the shore rather than sink in the deep. Had the Concordia sunk at a depth of 200 meters, where it was at the time of the collision, the ship would have been completely submerged, and the death toll could have been dozens of times higher. But the pumps failed, the flooding continued to intensify, and the list increased. Finally, at 10:35 p.m., almost an hour after the collision, the order to abandon ship was given from the bridge, and the emergency alarm was sounded. A full hour. For a full hour, the captain and his officers knew the ship was sinking and did not order an evacuation. For a full hour, the passengers remained in the dark, receiving false assurances of a technical malfunction. For a full hour, water filled compartment after compartment, and the list increased, and with each passing minute, the evacuation became more difficult and dangerous. That lost hour cost lives. By this point, 4,229 people were on board the Concordia. Every passenger and crew member began making their way to the fourth deck, crowding around the lifeboats, which were lowered one after another. By this time, the decks had tilted so much that walking was almost impossible. People fell, slid on the wet surfaces, clung to the railings and to each other. Elderly passengers and children were unable to move independently and had to be carried. Stairs that had seemed normal just a few hours earlier turned into sloping obstacles that had to be climbed rather than descended. By 10:03 p.m., the ship was listing to starboard by more than 25 degrees. Any hope of saving the vessel was lost. As the lifeboats continued to descend, the list worsened, and soon lowering the lifeboats from the port side became physically impossible. 3 lifeboats on the port side were never launched. This is why so many people remained on board the ship even after the evacuation was announced. By 10:30 p.m., the Concordia's bridge was abandoned. Most of the senior officers, including Captain Schettino himself, had already abandoned their posts. The water had reached the fourth deck, and the ship's flooding accelerated. The list had reached such a degree that the ship was practically lying on its side. About 80 people still remained on the ship. They had to descend the hull using rope ladders to the Coast Guard rescue boats waiting below. Captain Schettino was already on shore by this time. The Coast Guard demanded that he return aboard. He did not. This moment became perhaps the most infamous episode of the entire disaster. A recording of the conversation between Captain Schettino and Coast Guard officer Gregorio De Falco was broadcast around the world. De Falco ordered Schettino to climb the rope ladder back on board and coordinate the rescue of the remaining people. Schettino responded incoherently, making excuses, claiming that the first mate was already on board. De Falco grew impatient. His voice grew increasingly harsh. He demanded that the captain return aboard immediately. Schettino continued to evade him. Then De Falco uttered the phrase that became a popular saying in Italy and a symbol of the entire tragedy. He ordered the captain to board, using expressions that could not be translated into polite form. The gist was simple. You are the captain, people are dying, return to your ship. Schettino did not return. A captain who abandoned his ship and his passengers. Maritime law and centuries-old tradition require that the captain be the last to abandon ship. Schettino was one of the first to leave. The Coast Guard continued to film people clinging to the side of the sinking ship. The residents of Giglio Island, a tiny island with a population of less than 1,000, took in thousands of wet, cold, and frightened passengers. They opened the doors of their homes, providing dry clothing, hot food, and blankets. That night, the small island of Giglio became a refuge for thousands of strangers, and the humanity of its residents became the only bright spot in this dark story. As the Concordia drifted toward the shore, the ship rested on the coastal rocks at an angle of approximately 80 degrees. The starboard side was completely submerged. At 6:17 a.m., the rescue operation was officially completed. The rising sun revealed the true scale of the disaster. A gaping hole in the port side, now facing skyward, revealed the severity of the impact. The jagged edges of the steel testified to the monstrous force of the impact with the rocks. 3 unlaunched lifeboats were visible near the hull, mute testimony to why so many people were unable to abandon ship in time. 32 people died in the sinking. 27 of them were passengers, 5 were crew members. Almost all the victims were trapped on the lower decks as water rushed inside the ship. Bodies were found mostly on the lower decks, indicating that people were trapped inside the ship when it capsized. 4 bodies were found in the main atrium elevators, the very same elevators that rose 10 decks and were the pride of the ship had become death traps. 9 more bodies were recovered from 2 other elevators. People had entered them, attempting to reach the lifeboats, when the doors closed, causing the water to rise. Shortly after the sinking, Carnival Corporation and its insurance company declared the ship a total loss, with damages exceeding $500 million. More than 2,000 tons of fuel and oil were pumped out of the ship to prevent an ecological disaster in the pristine waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Giglio Island is part of a marine reserve, and any oil spill would have caused irreparable damage to the fragile ecosystem. Then began one of the most complex and expensive salvage operations in maritime history. The task seemed nearly impossible: to lift and remove the half-submerged 114,000-ton cruise liner lying on its side on the coastal rocks. No such operation had ever been attempted on a vessel of such size. A plan was devised. Install a steel underwater platform under the hull, weld giant buoyancy pontoons to the port side, and slowly turn the ship upright. This technique is called parbuckling, and while it had been used to lift smaller vessels before, no one had ever used it on a ship weighing hundreds of thousands of tons. The operation took over a year and a half of preparation. Hundreds of engineers and divers worked around the clock, installing the platform and welding pontoons to the hull of the ship lying on its side in salt water. On September 16, 2013, after 19 hours of non-stop work, the Costa Concordia was finally upright. As the ship stood upright, the extent of the damage became apparent. The starboard side, on which the vessel had lain for over 20 months, was completely crushed. The steel balconies of the cabins had flattened like foil under the ship's weight. The hull below the waterline was covered in a thick layer of algae, barnacles, and marine organisms, which over nearly 2 years had transformed the smooth steel into a rough biological carpet. Photos of the interior taken after the recovery were surreal. The luxurious restaurants, where tables still stood overturned with dried-on plates and glasses, were covered in dirt and sludge. The swimming pools had become algae-choked tanks. The main atrium, once gleaming with crystal and polished marble, stood in semi-darkness, covered in rust and mold. In the starboard cabins, furniture lay against the walls, as the walls had become the floor when the ship rolled onto its side. Passengers' personal belongings, suitcases, clothes, children's toys, cameras, lay amidst the mud and debris. The modern cruise liner, built just 6 years ago, looked like a ghost ship from a horror movie. After pontoons were installed on her starboard side, the Concordia was raised above the underwater platform and became afloat for the first time since the sinking. On July 14, 2014, she was towed on her final journey to the Italian port of Genoa, where she was completely dismantled for scrap. By July 2017, nothing remained of the Costa Concordia. The total cost of the salvage operation was $1.2 billion, twice the cost of building the ship itself. After the disaster, a search for those responsible began. 6 people were arrested and brought to trial. Several senior Concordia officers received prison sentences, most for less than 2 years. The director of Costa's Crisis Center, with whom Captain Schettino had been in contact during the events, received the longest sentence among his subordinates, 2 years and 10 months. But the main defendant, of course, was Captain Francesco Schettino himself. His story became a symbol of cowardice and irresponsibility. At his trial, Schettino tried to portray himself as a victim of circumstance. He claimed that he was coordinating the rescue operation at the time of the sinking and that he ended up in the lifeboat by accident. He allegedly slipped and fell into it due to the listing of the deck. This version of events provoked astonishment, bordering on disbelief in the courtroom. Later, a video emerged showing a man remarkably similar to Schettino calmly standing at the railing on the deck, waiting to board the lifeboat. No crash, no slip. A calm, almost businesslike landing. The captain claimed it wasn't him. The court didn't believe him. It also emerged that the woman Schettino brought onto the bridge that fateful night was his lover. He insisted her presence had no impact on the events. He also claimed he should not be held responsible for the deaths of the 32 people, as they died not from the initial impact, but from the ship's sinking. This argument was rejected by the court. Schettino was found guilty of manslaughter, causing the ship to sink and endangering passengers. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Carnival Corporation felt the full financial impact of the disaster. In its annual report for 2012, the company reported a $410 million loss in revenue as a direct result of the Concordia sinking. That year was a nightmare for Carnival. In addition to the Concordia, the company suffered a disaster on another ship. The Carnival Triumph lost power while at sea, leaving thousands of passengers stranded for several days on the immobilized vessel without proper water or sanitation. Each surviving passenger on the Concordia was offered $13,000 in compensation, including the cost of their cruise. Total damages from the disaster, including salvage, legal costs, compensation, and lost revenue, amounted to approximately $2 billion. It's hard to believe, but exactly 100 years after the Titanic's sinking, human error once again destroyed something once considered unsinkable. The Concordia didn't hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic. It crashed into a rock off the coast of a tiny Italian island because its captain decided to show off for passengers by making an illegal maneuver. The ship was only 5 years old. It cost $570 million. All that money, all that technology, all those safety systems proved powerless against one man who decided the rules weren't written for him. The Concordia disaster changed the cruise industry forever. Following the sinking, international maritime safety standards were revised. The new regulations required mandatory drills for passengers before a ship departs port, rather than within the first 24 hours of a voyage, as had previously been allowed. At the time of the Concordia disaster, no drills had yet been conducted for passengers on this voyage. Many people didn't know where their life jackets were or where to go in case of evacuation. Requirements for ship routes, crew competence, and passenger emergency information procedures were also tightened. Carnival changed management and declared safety its top priority. But for the 32 victims, all this was too late. Their names are inscribed on a memorial plaque on Giglio Island, the very island Captain Schettino wanted to pass so dramatically on Friday the 13th. Every year, on the anniversary of the tragedy, a bell rings 32 times on the island, one for each person lost. The people of Giglio have not forgotten that night, and the world must not forget.